Good afternoon and welcome to Pathbreakers, speaker series at George Mason. I'm Marc Austin, Executive Director for New Ventures. I
This
am
meeting
extremely
is being
excited
recorded
today to have Matt Sigelman join me, CEO of Burning Glass. Burning Glass is the leading labor market analytics firm that helps universities think through both what the opportunities are for new educational degrees and certifications, but also helps us make really good decisions about what students should be thinking about in terms of their career. So today we're going to talk a little bit in our 24 minutes of Pathbreakers conversation about how students can think about job markets, what universities can do to respond to changes in labor markets and job markets. So what's cool about Matt is that he is sitting on top of a ton of data that informs a lot of what we think about in higher ed. I'm very excited to have you, Matt, today. And maybe to kick us off, you could talk a little bit about your view of the Virginia labor market and what changes are occurring, what opportunities and challenges we have. So thank you, Matt.
Well, and thank you, Marc. Just delighted to join this conversation and really honored. I think the Northern Virginia labor market is a particularly fascinating one because in some ways it kind of represents the microcosm of a lot of the forces that are reshaping the job market nationwide and actually globally as well. First of all, of course, that doesn't take a lot of job market data to know that the economy in Northern Virginia is white hot right now, and there's been a huge pace of job creation, and that so much of that has been focused in the tech economy and in the data economy as well. And as an example, demand for data science in the DC metro area is over 3 times greater per capita, numbers of jobs per capita than that is in other cities. The DC metro area is, including Northern Virginia, is second only to New York in terms of demand for big data skills. It ranks very highly in terms of, in fact, I think one of the highest in the country in terms of cybersecurity demand. So a range of these kinds of tech forces that are reshaping the economy are right in the middle of, DC is right in the middle of. In fact, by the way, we recently pulled some data on the DC area in the wake of Amazon's decision to locate in Crystal City. The Wall Street Journal called us up and said, hey, can you help us figure out what may have sort of driven some of that? And what we did was sort of interesting analysis, just to go a little bit off to the side here for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
We said, let's understand Amazon and what they look for, and they look for a lot of software engineers. But specifically, when you look at their software engineers, Amazon's a pretty leading-edge company, and so their software engineers, more than other software engineers, are much more likely to need machine learning skills. They're more likely to need Python skills. They're more likely to need big data skills, which is not actually the kind of DNA of your typical software engineer. So then we said, okay, where would you go if that's what you're looking for? Now, New York wins by the law of numbers because there's just more of everything in New York. But what we also found was that once you look at where are the places in the country that have the highest concentrations of that talent, in other words, the most jobs per capita, one of the things you find is that DC is one of the clear leaders across categories, and a little bit more economical than other places. So splitting between New York and DC made all the sense in the world. Here's the more interesting thing, though, about this phenomenon of this tremendous growth in jobs in the DC area around the tech and data economies. Those are skill sets. We're used to thinking about coding skills, for example, being about coding jobs, about tech jobs. We're used to thinking about data skills being about the provenance of jobs in data science. What we actually see is that much more demand for those skills is in the kind of jobs that we're all used to thinking about every day. Jobs like marketing managers, life science jobs, finance jobs, and the like, which increasingly are coming to require those sets of skills. And so in this way, actually, one of the most profound things that we've observed in the job market, and as you said, we collect millions of job postings every day and translate them back to a common language so that universities and government agencies and employers can really get a sense for where is the job market, what's going on. What we're finding is more than lots of jobs going away and jobs being born and all the kind of hype that you tend to hear about, much more of what we see is that the DNA of jobs is getting rewritten. And increasingly, it's being rewritten not just because technologies have a faster and faster half-life, or shorter and shorter half-life, rather, but instead they're getting rewritten because increasingly jobs are coming to require skills that are almost orthogonal to the traditional definition of those jobs. Skills that would have in previous generations had no earthly business being in that job. Marketing managers, as an example, are about as quick to fill as professional jobs get. Among IT skills, SQL skills, of being able to construct a database, are about as vanilla as skills get. But now I want my marketing manager to be able to construct and manipulate a customer database. Those jobs are really hard to fill. We call those hybrid jobs because they're jobs that require people to wear multiple hats. Now, here's why I bring this up in the context of the D.C. area. This is more of an answer you were bargaining for. But what we've seen in the D.C. area is that D.C. is one of the places that's leading the country in terms of the hybridization of jobs. So it's not just that there's all these coding jobs and all these data jobs and cybersecurity jobs, but those skills are showing up in D.C. perhaps even more than elsewhere across a broad array of jobs. In fact, the D.C. and Northern Virginia Metro ranks 5th nationwide for demand for hybridized skills. These are jobs like UI UX developers, which when you think about that job, it's part of it's design, part of it's software development, part of it's marketing and so forth. So you can kind of see lots of different hats that don't get worn in the same head. That's a big challenge to the world of higher education.
So do you think that moving forward, employers are going to do a better job of articulating not only the job description that they're looking for, but the skills underneath it? Because I think a lot of us worry in higher ed that if we build a degree that gives you a certain domain experience, domain expertise, but not the skills that someone's looking for, and those don't map well to an employer side, then there's a disconnect, right? We're producing more students with a particular kind of background that don't match up to what the employer is looking for. So how do you connect those two, the employer and the university?
Yeah, and I think this is where data comes in, because I think, to your point, there's the way that this has tended to happen in the past has something of the feeling of the old kind of Soviet-era central planned economy of, okay, we're going to create lots of engineers, and they're all going to look the same, and they're going to come out and get placed, and then guess what? There's no more demand. So much of this comes down to the ability to really read employer demand at scale and to project forward that demand so that we're developing a skill base in our graduates that serves not just where those jobs are today, but ensures that those people have viability through their careers.
Right.
A lot of what we've done is taken a big data approach, in fact, to understanding the job market. So instead of trying to understand broad categories of demand, for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics still tracks a job called computer programmer. What we're doing instead is saying, hey, let's be able to get down to a real level of granularity. You hit the nail on the head, Mark, when you talked about the skills involved and how we make sure that we bridge that last mile of skills. Because in a lot of cases, we're developing the right programs broad, writ large, but for students to make successful transition and to have competitive advantage in their careers requires sets of skills that may be non-obvious. I'll give you an example.
Yeah. But
From
we've been talking, Matt, just briefly, we've been talking a little bit about what you've seen in universities and what universities are doing to help bridge that gap. I'm thinking of a little bit of the work that you've done in Florida. What have you observed universities to do to develop those skills to connect it to what employers need?
So I think this comes down to a couple of steps that schools can take. One is in terms of how they develop programs and what kind of programs they develop and how they continue to assess the alignment of those programs. Second, it's how they engage faculty as direct partners in this process. And the third is how they think about the scope of or how they think about the student experience all the way through. And then finally, it's also about how they really focus on, as part of that student experience, not just the core parts of the curriculum, but what I refer to as last mile skills. It's probably worth talking about each of those separately. So first of all, in terms of program development, I'll try to bring in some examples on each of these.
Great.
A lot of this comes down to realizing that as we develop new programs, how do we identify where the whites, and that's as higher education institutions develop new programs, how do we identify where the white spaces are in the market, where there's strong demand, where there's potential for jobs and skills to be disruptive and therefore to have enduring value and significant value. And often, I think this is the key thing, we're used to thinking about skills gaps in broad language. But the skills gap, actually, as the terminology implies, more often about skills than it is about jobs. And so these mismatches are often pretty micro. And so the more granular that institutions can be about identifying where there are places where demand's not being met, where there's opportunity. So, for example, Northeastern University in Boston has been very aggressive at mining job market data to be able to identify opportunity, both in expanding to new locations, but even in their core Boston campus. One of the first programs that they did this with was, they were looking at the life science sector around Boston. You don't need a lot of data to be able to tell you that there's a lot of life science companies in the Boston area, and they hire a lot of people with life science from various stripes of the life science spectrum. When they started digging into the data, they found that these companies, it's not a huge number of jobs, but there's a pool of jobs which they were really struggling to fill, which I can't remember even what they're called. Let's call them regulatory project managers.
Yeah. It's a very specific thing, right?
Very specific, and you sort of think about what it takes to, and by the way, a great example of a hybrid job. What does it take to move a compound through discovery and trials and whatever? And so you need enough life science knowledge to be dangerous. You need, enough regulatory knowledge to be able to manage the FDA approvals, and you need to have really good project management skills. Each of those is a specialty, but how do you bring it together? They created a master's in what I think they call regulatory affairs. Sell-out success. Lather, rinse, repeat 35 times. And that's been part of how Northeastern's had a meteoric growth in its professional services revenue base.
Right. So what you're saying is understand that job market and then build the degree toward that job market. There's probably a certain amount of, it's not just data, it's a conversation that you need to have with employers.
Absolutely. Yep.
So are there other examples, of where universities
so
have
that's
taken
sort of step one. By the way, another aspect of this is making sure that you're continuing to evaluate your existing programs to say, hey, am I teaching, are the things that we're teaching in those programs that continue to be current with the market? Are the programs overall current with the market? I won't name names because people tend to be embarrassed of closing programs, but I take sort of, I would say that there's when we can identify where programs are starting to get out of whack, or out of sync with the market,
sure,
and help make strategic decisions around how do you bring them back in the fold, that's a really clearly important thing as well. There's a third aspect of this, though, which is, I mentioned before, last mile skills. Mm-hmm. And that's how we make sure that students are acquiring the skills that will provide them with differentiation. Give you an example. Psychology majors nationwide at 5 years out are making $42,000 a year. The general impression that most of us have, which is that psych majors are pre-professional students, that they're all going to go on to get PhDs in psychology and go into clinical practice. Of course, the significant majority never do. So we looked at this field. It's one of the biggest majors in the country. So they often get this advice that, hey, you understand consumer psychology, you should go get a marketing minor. Well,
right.
Instead of making $42,000, you make $39,000. So not great advice. A psychology student, on the other hand, who in the course of doing her psychology studies does some survey research and picks up SAS or R, SPSS to manipulate the findings, is making $68,000. Right? This is not don't go into psychology. This is make sure that in our psychology program we're giving students the right sets of skills that not only help them make successful transition to jobs, but that help them make successful transition to well-paying and high-mobility jobs.
And that makes so much sense. The hybrid job is some form of, let's say, foundation in social science, say psychology, added with some data or technology component. So that brings us to the student. How would a student know how to find that pathway through a university? How can your data and perspective on the job market inform a student's career decision that way?
Well, I think part of this comes back to how we can think about the student experience overall, longitudinally, and how we make sure that that there's a supporting scaffold around the traditional academic program that enables students to be well informed as they're making decisions throughout. And then it starts pre-enrollment. And we're seeing growing sets of universities who are providing data to prospective students up front to say, hey, here's how you should be thinking about choice of schools. Here's the kind of jobs. When we talk about this program of study, we are thinking about the kind of jobs that it's going to lead you to, and here's how what those jobs are going to represent to you in your future. Because students and their families are thinking about those questions, and so for schools who can talk in that language, it gives them a significant competitive advantage, and it helps students make better decisions. As I move along, as I start to pick a major, how do I make sure that students have that view? As I'm picking courses, again, think about that notion of a last-mile skill. How do I provide a visibility into course pathways that help my students acquire the skills and navigate themselves through? And ultimately, how do I, get the right kinds of internships and then place into jobs? The problem has been that the career word, just often been a dirty word in higher education, where we think about it has traditionally been thought of both by students and by universities back of the house at best first semester senior year, more often second semester senior year, and often not till the end of senior year. And at that point, students either have the right set of skills or they don't.
Right. Yeah, and so we need to be able to help prevent that, make sure that as they go through their process, they're making informed decisions at each step of the way. And I think Burning Glass has a great opportunity to help inform not only the advisor, but also the career counselor and ultimately the student on how to make those decisions. The speed, though, that labor markets change can be a problem, not only for a student who's trying to make their way through a pipeline, but in particular for a university, where it's so hard to change our curriculum to adapt to those changes. Have you seen universities being able to take your data and make those kind of smaller course corrections along the way and provide better services to the student?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And by the way, it also speaks to the importance of liberal arts, which I hope we'll get to if our time allows. But I think you're absolutely right. The half-life of skills is very, very short. And part of the implication of a hybrid job economy, again, is that people are going to need to acquire new skills over time. So on the one hand, that's a big challenge. At the same time that over the last 5 years there's been almost fivefold growth in demand for data scientists, the skills within those jobs have changed even faster. So, for example, demand within data science jobs for data visualization skills, for big data architecture skills has grown more than 20-fold each, even as those jobs are growing fivefold, right? So even if you had the crystal ball 5 years ago and said, hey, we're going to start a program in data science, you may or may not have been teaching the right skills.
Right.
So that speaks to a need to be able to create a structure that, on the one hand, is providing very strong foundational skills that enable students to acquire skills as they go along. And it also speaks to the need to create a structure that provides students visibility to those last mile of skills, so that as they're approaching the market, they acquire the skills that are going to differentiate them and get them higher value. That notion of core foundations can't be overstated. When we see so much in the market and we look at what employers feel the biggest skill gaps around, a lot of it is the skills that are the hallmarks of the traditional American liberal arts system. It's writing skills, it's creativity skills, it's collaboration, all those kinds of things. The problem is that we're used to thinking of it as an either-or. Either you have a great liberal arts education or you have a technical education, and those two sides of the academy tend to duke it out. And in fact, what we see is that in a hybrid job economy, students need both.
And that's, I think, we have room for one more question, but I think that's a great way of framing it, which is our region is a leader in the hybrid jobs. And what you're saying, as I understand, is that the liberal arts foundation that you get added, and when you add a couple of skills, a couple of credentials, maybe something that is non-traditional to a degree program, you produce a student who's perfect for our market. I'm going to shift gears with this last question, though, because I think that's super valuable insight, and we're doing a lot of thinking about what kind of credentials we can add to a student's experience to get them into the right place without completely re-architecting the entire degree. But the last is lifelong learning. So we know that in this market, it's not just our traditional students. It's plenty of adult learners, folks coming back to the market, folks who need to complete. Do you have a perspective on the future for lifelong learning and the way a university can prepare to help manage skills into the future?
So first of all, for its traditional student base, I think this is part of the reason why developing those foundations is so important. And by the way, we've done some work which is forthcoming through the Business Higher Ed Foundation, which is looking at those what are the foundational skills for the new economy. One of the things we found is that they actually, instead of being the base of the USDA food pyramid, these are the skills that get more valuable over time.
Right.
But what I think, to your point, universities have been oriented around competing for the same 3.5 million students who graduate from high school every year. At the same time, there's about 150 million working Americans. There's about 35 million Americans who have some credit, no degree. Those are in an era when universities have rising costs and shrinking traditional student bases just due to demographics. This is where there's the biggest opportunity to serve a much bigger audience. Because in a hybrid job economy, people need to acquire skills over time, and that's not in the traditional bundles of getting a master's degree necessarily. It's, I'm a marketing manager and I need to learn some data skills. And here's the good news. Those skills already, for the most part, live within great universities like Mason. This is not like, hey, we need to create a whole new curriculum. One of the things that we've been doing, for example, with the Florida Metropolitan Research Consortium universities, FIU and USF and UCF, is going and actually looking at ways to map their entire curriculum to a job market language as opposed to just the traditional learning outcomes and learning objectives vocabulary that academia is used to thinking about. When you do that, one of the things you realize is there's a lot of these nuggets of value which have much bigger market and much greater relevance than just traditional students.
Matt, we're right up at time. That is exactly the point I wanted to leave us on, which is there is gold. With big data like the data sets you provide, there's a way to get to that gold, especially for the adult learner and the traditional learner. I want to thank you for your time today. And for those of you who've joined the call, thank you very much for spending that fast 24 minutes with us as we do every month. If you're interested in more on Pathbreakers speaker series, please visit ventures.gmu.edu. And Matt, thanks again.
Mark, thank you. Golden Imnar Hills.
There we go.